Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. On today's episode, we take a closer look at the situation in Belarus. On the 25th of March, on Belarusian Freedom Day, Alexander Lukashenko was sworn in as President of Belarus for the 7th time. His strong-armed rule over the country has been characterized by detentions of independent journalists, violent dispersion of pro-democratic protests, and repressions against pro-European political candidates. Let's take a look at our latest report to find out more about the situation.
This is a commemoration of Belarus's Freedom Day. The celebration marks the creation of the Belarusian Democratic Republic in 1918, which only lasted for a short time before it was overrun by Soviet forces. The day has come to symbolize the struggle of Belarusian democratic society against Alexander Lukashenko's dictatorship, and the terrible price that those at the dictator in prisons must pay.
When I was shivering, I stopped. I imagined my wife and children hugging me, warming me up. And strangely enough, it did work.
Hundreds of people are still behind bars in Belarus. One of them is independent Belarusian journalist Andrzej Poczobut. March 25th saw the 4th anniversary of his imprisonment. He remains one of the symbols of the Belarusian regime's crackdown. That very same day also marked the inauguration of Alexander Lukashenko to a new term. Each of his presidencies, their legitimacy questioned internationally, has brought the country closer to Russia.
Everything is fine with freedom of speech. We have more democracy than those who call themselves its standard.
Lukashenko claims that freedom of speech is doing fine in his country, but reports show the opposite. Brutal repressions have forced almost all oppositionists out of the country. Those who remain have either been forced into hiding, silenced under threat, or simply imprisoned. On the day that Belarusians celebrate freedom, for most of the country, it seems but a far-off dream.
And now let's zone in on the East-splaining portion of our show. Vladimir Putin and Alexander Lukashenko are two of the world's most recognizable autocrats. Their alliance goes back many years, but this partnership seems to be more of a case of strange bedfellows rather than an actual friendship.
Alexander Lukashenko has been around longer than Vladimir Putin. In fact, he's been around so long that he established his country's relationship with Russia with Putin's predecessor, barring that short stint by Dmitry Medvedev, Boris Yeltsin. Since Putin came to power, however, Lukashenko started playing a very dangerous yet tight political game. For many years he tried to balance between maintaining a semblance of good relations with the West, while also keeping his powerful and possibly dangerous neighbor at bay. Various reports and biopics show that behind all the smiles and hugs there is a certain amount of tension between the two. Both sides try to pressure one another behind the scenes, but it is also undeniable that since the 2020 presidential elections in Belarus, Russia's influence over the country has grown. Lukashenko cracked down on opposition and made a turn towards becoming more like Putin in how he runs the country. Lukashenko is a junior partner in this relationship, but he has also shown, and Putin is undoubtedly aware of this, that he is capable of outlasting almost anyone, including, possibly, Putin himself at some point.
And now, as always, it's time to take a look at the issue in greater detail. Alexander Lukashenko was sworn in as President of Belarus for the 7th time, despite the international community refusing to recognize the legitimacy of his rule since 2020. The recent sham election, held on the 26th of January, took place under state repression, with opposition candidates barred from running. According to Lukashenko-controlled officials, he officially secured 86.82% of the vote. Now, his inauguration date coincides with the Belarusian Freedom Day, marking the independence of the Belarusian People's Republic of 1918, a holiday Lukashenko's regime has long opposed due to its pro-independence and anti-Russian stance. Since the year 2020, Freedom Day has been celebrated mainly by the Belarusian diaspora, especially in Poland. Now, the 25th of March also marks the 4th anniversary of the imprisonment of journalist and Polish minority activist Andrzej Poczobut. Arrested in 2021, he was sentenced to 8 years in 2023 for inciting hatred, a charge widely condemned as politically motivated. Human rights organizations consider him a political prisoner, while Polish authorities continue to demand his release. Negotiations between Warsaw and Minsk are ongoing, but Lukashenko reportedly sees Poczobut as a bargaining chip for securing the return of Belarusian opposition figures in exile. Poczobut, a correspondent for Polish media and a historian, refused offers of freedom in exchange for leaving Belarus. He is currently held in Novopolotsk prison, known for its harsh conditions. Despite international pressure, Belarusian Supreme Court has upheld his sentence. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Alexander Papko, journalist from TV Belsat. Hello and welcome to the VP World.
Hello, nice to see you.
So, the inauguration of Lukashenko is important for a couple of reasons. First of all, he chose the date of his inauguration deliberately. Apparently, he is trying to steal, or appropriate, probably would be the word he might be using, a very important holiday for ordinary Belarusians, one that he pretended did not exist earlier on.
I think Alexander Lukashenko in such ways trying to humiliate his opponents and try to underline, stress his authorities, his power by showing symbolically his victory, his inauguration for another term in the date of when the First Belarusian National Republic was proclaimed in 1918. So it was the most important, and it is the most important date, holiday, or the day of celebration for the proponents of democratic Belarus, of pro-European Belarus. So by celebrating his own personal dictatorship victory in the day of freedom, he tried, I believe, to humiliate rather than to appropriate this important date.
So the man who opposes freedom is celebrating his inauguration on Freedom Day, a holiday that's also important because during the Soviet era, it was banned because it was intrinsically directed against the Soviet occupation. It was about commemorating the real Belarusian freedom, right? Something that, once again, under Lukashenko, is unfortunately in short supply.
Exactly. Alexander Lukashenko keeps his power thanks to the economic, political, ideological infrastructure inherited from the Soviet Union. On this picture, you may see these gatherings, all these flags, state symbols. They're really similar to the Soviet times. And Alexander Lukashenko, after coming to power, he started to restore Soviet-like institutions in order to continue this authoritarian tradition and to keep his power virtually forever. And for him, obviously, as for Soviet authorities, the Belarusian non-Soviet tradition, the Belarusian language, proper culture, not imported from Russia, and proper Belarusian days of celebration, days of statehood, they are a threat to his power. So that's why he's fighting against the day of 25th of March 1918 in the same way as Soviet authorities did.
Now, Lukashenko, in his usual style, is being really brazen about what he is doing in Belarus. One of the things he said during the inauguration was that, I'm quoting from memory, but this is more or less what he said, half of the world actually envies our dictatorship. They would like to be like us. Now, I'm not sure which half of the world he was referring to, but certainly the 1,200 or so political prisoners in Belarus would clearly think otherwise. Why do you think Lukashenko actually believes that there might be someone who would still be willing to live under his rule rather than in a true democracy? He also said that we Belarusians, in our system, have freedom of speech, which, well, sounds just like it sounds, quite absurd, doesn't it?
As about freedom of speech, after a so-called election staged by Lukashenko in January, he told to the BBC journalist that you have a choice, either to be here and talk to me in a nice way, or to get to the prisons, and this is a free choice, according to him. So this is about freedom of speech. And what about the good, beautiful life under the dictatorship? So some political scientists and some economists would say that when authoritarian power can ensure some kind of stability and some kind of rules, it may bring some minimal level of economic well-being. So Belarus is not extremely poor country, but the problem is that without institutions which guarantees rights to everybody and which includes everybody into as much people as possible, which includes as much people as possible, to the political and economic activities, you cannot build a prosperous society. So, as about Belarus, obviously, Belarusian people live much wealthier than people in, sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, or Southeast Asia. But the problem with Belarus that is middle to low income country, which stays at this level for more or less 15 years. So, and this lack of economic development is a clear, absolute result of authoritarian rule of Alexander Lukashenko.
So, of course, we also have issues such as lack of democracy, lack of freedom of speech, contrary to what Mr. Lukashenko seems to believe, which, by the way, is something that Belsat TV knows very well, because some of your journalists were actually arrested by Lukashenko. But we also have the situation with many other political prisoners, i.e. not only journalists, but also members of the opposition, activists. One of them, the Polish activist Andrzej Papko, has been held captive for years now. So can you tell us more about the situation currently and about any prospects for the release of these prisoners? Because it seems like Lukashenko might be looking for an opening with his talks with the West, in that he might be willing to trade some of these prisoners in exchange for, well, concessions, apparently.
Indeed, after coming of President Trump to power in the United States and some prospects of peaceful negotiation or ceasefire negotiation in Ukraine, Alexander Lukashenko tried to send signals to the West by releasing about almost 200 political prisoners. So it was one unilateral move from his side. Obviously, he tried to show that he's open to negotiation, but at the same time, he continued prosecution of others, and the general number of people arrested and detained has not changed so much. So he just took new prisoners while releasing others. Indeed, Alexander Lukashenko started negotiations with the United States, and as some envoys of the White House told to the media, those negotiations are focused on probable exchange of political prisoners, on the release of sanctions from some potassium producers in Belarus, producers of fertilizers.
Potash is a very important ingredient of fertilizers, so this is the card he's trying to play. How strong are his cards, really? Because he does have these political prisoners. Andrzej Papko is among them. He probably thinks that this is an important figure that he might be trying to trade in exchange for some concessions. But then again, in the overall atmosphere of apparent upcoming rapprochement between the US and Russia, which is something that's looming on the horizon, wouldn't Lukashenko's efforts be lost among this? I.e., if there is a rapprochement anyway, will the things that he has to offer actually matter that much? Because he's not going to differentiate himself from Russia, if Russia is actually, being invited back to the world stage when it comes to being a respectable country, apparently, despite waging a war against its neighbor. So Belarus is going to be lost in the crowd, so to say. Don't you think that this could be a problem there?
Yeah, for him it's definitely a problem, and just one remark, just one proof of this being lost. The sanctions against potash producers in Belarus were imposed for violating human rights, and Russian fertilizers producers are not under international sanctions. So he wants to attach his cause, his interests to the Russian-U.S. negotiations. But as far as I can see now, the possible release of political prisoners may concern only American citizens or people working for the U.S. institutions as Radio Free Europe. And I don't see that even in these categories, Lukashenko will release all the political prisoners. And certainly Andrei Pochobot, journalist Andrei Pochobot, is not part of this U.S. Minsk deal.
And this is really concerning because, I mean, he's been in prison for quite a while and his health is deteriorating. He is being held in one of the worst penal colonies in Belarus. Would you think that bilateral negotiations are an option there? Could this perhaps be something that might help in this matter?
The Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs has stressed already several times that they were carrying out negotiations with the Alexander Lukashenko regime focused on releasing Andrei Pochobot. But the problem is, in my opinion, in the demands of Alexander Lukashenko. Probably he demands too much or things which cannot be executed. So this is a problem of Alexander Lukashenko because he's a very Andrei Pochobot for him is a very particular, really high-priced prisoner.
Of course, one has to remember that all of these prisoners are there on trumped-up charges. Like Andrei Pochobot was accused of rehabilitating Nazism. Well, his real guilt was that he was simply standing up for people who are being repressed. He was standing up for the Polish minority. So this is the real life under a dictatorship, and not something that Lukashenko can actually change by glossing over that and putting a varnish on that in an inaugural speech in front of his supporters. Alexander Papko was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you very much.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. The United States, Russia and Ukraine have agreed to a partial ceasefire in the Black Sea. The announcement comes in the wake of two-day talks in Saudi Arabia.
The three countries have agreed to, quote, eliminate the use of force and prevent the usage of commercial vessels for military purposes in the Black Sea. In exchange, the United States has said it will help restore Russian access to the world market so Moscow can export agricultural goods and fertilizer. It is also meant to help lower maritime insurance costs and improve access to ports and payment systems for these purposes. Ukraine's defense minister has commented on the ceasefire, saying that Kyiv would consider it a violation if Russia should move warships outside of the eastern part of the Black Sea. The White House has also announced that it agreed with Moscow and Kyiv to develop measures meant to lead to a ban on strikes on energy infrastructure in both countries.
According to Ukrainian industry publication Info Industria, Ukraine's fertilizer production has dropped by almost 50%, reportedly due to Russia's shelling of Ukrainian gas infrastructure.
Russian strikes on several parts of Ukraine's infrastructure having a widespread effect on the country's entire industry and economy. Kyiv's fertilizer manufacturers have had to reduce their nitrogen fertilizer production in March due to operational challenges resulting from Russian attacks. Two of Ukraine's leading plants have dropped their operational loads to 45% and 31% respectively, a massive decline compared to mid-February when both plants were operating at around 66% capacity. Experts also forecasting that the urea production in Ukraine will drop by between 45% to 50% compared to the same period in 2024. Various import alternatives are also currently limited for Ukraine, and thus fertilizer prices are expected to remain high. What's more, a report by the Ukrainian Ministry of Economy showed that economic growth in the country had slowed to 0.7% in February, with a tax on infrastructure having significant impact on this drop.
A Danish export fund is offering a $100 million shield for defense investments in Ukraine. The fund is meant to cover up to 70% of Danish investments in Kiev's defense sector.
Denmark says it has introduced a state guarantee mechanism meant to support Ukrainian defense investments. The guarantee is expected to greatly reduce risks for Danish companies, which have shown interest in taking up opportunities in relation to Kiev's defense sector. The fund also offers various financial instruments to facilitate the investments, including export credit guarantees, direct loans to Ukrainian buyers of Danish goods and services, and even capital meant to expand the operations of Danish companies in Ukraine. The mechanism's announcement comes after Ukraine and Denmark agreed to fast-track its creation in November 2024. This new streamlined approach eliminates several administrative barriers, which will make it much easier for Danish business to enter the Ukrainian market.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.